He was 4 years old. He had never been here before, and he knew exactly which room it happened in. We moved in on a Saturday in late October. My husband had found the property through a county auction. Old farmhouse, 40 acres, priced the way things get priced when no one wants them. We didn't ask many questions. We had a kid, a budget, and a dream about vegetable gardens and quiet mornings. We signed the papers and drove 3 hours north with everything we owned in a rented trailer. The house was cold when we walked in. Not the cold of a house that needed the heat turned on. Something slower than that. Something that had been sitting in the walls for a long time. I told myself it was just October. I told myself a lot of things that first week. Our son. I'll call him the boy throughout this, because I'm not giving his name to the internet. Walked through the front door ahead of us, which was unusual. He was a cautious kid. Held your hand in parking lots, always checked before crossing, always waited. But he walked into that house like he already knew the layout. He turned left at the end of the entry hall without hesitating. We hadn't shown him the floor plan. We'd barely shown him photos. I noticed it, filed it under kids are weird, and went back to carrying boxes. The first thing he said that I can't explain happened on the third night. We were eating dinner, just the three of us, plastic forks because nothing was unpacked yet. And he looked at the ceiling of the kitchen and said, "She used to cook here too." I asked him who. He said, "The woman with the braid." My husband and I looked at each other. We didn't push it. We had both read enough parenting content to know that children have vivid imagination, that they process new environments through invented narrative, that this was developmentally normal and almost certainly nothing. We changed the subject. We talked about which box had the good coffee mugs. But here's what we didn't say out loud at dinner. Before we moved in, I had done a light Google search on the property address. Nothing came up except the county auction record and a brief mention in a local historical society newsletter from 2003. Something about farmhouses built before the railroad came through. I hadn't looked deeper. I wish I had. I also wish I hadn't. I'm genuinely unsure which. The drawings started about 2 weeks in. He had always liked drawing, cars mostly, occasionally dogs, the usual 4-year-old portfolio. But in that house he started drawing the same face. Every single day. Not childlike scribblings either. I mean something obsessive, the same oval, the same 2 eyes slightly too far apart, the same dark hair pulled back. He couldn't explain it when I asked. He'd just say, "That's her," and go back to coloring. I kept them all. I don't know why. Some instinct told me to. I put them in a folder in the filing cabinet like a person who is holding evidence for a trial they hope will never happen. By the end of November, the folder had 11 drawings. Now, I want you to stay with me here, because I know how this sounds from the outside. I know that if you describe this to a rational person over coffee, they would say, young kid, new house, overactive imagination, pattern-seeking parents. I have said all of those things to myself. I am saying some of them right now, even as I'm writing this. But what happened in December is not something I've been able to rationalize in the 4 years since. And believe me, I have tried. My husband drove into town for a hardware run and stopped at the County Historical Archive on a whim. He'd been curious about the house since we moved in, the kind of idle local history curiosity that's normal when you buy old property. He asked the archivist if there was anything on file for our address. She said yes. Pulled a folder. County record from 1951, a police report, and 2 newspaper clippings. The original occupant of the house was a woman in her mid-40s. She'd lived there alone after her husband died. She was murdered in the house in the summer of 1951. The case went unsolved. The newspaper had a photo. A woman standing in front of what was clearly our front porch. Dark hair, pulled back in a braid. My husband drove home and didn't say anything when he walked in. He just put the photocopy on the kitchen table and stood there. The boy was in the living room. He walked over, looked at it for maybe 3 seconds and said, completely flat, no drama, the way a child identifies a cartoon character they recognize. "That's her." He went back to his trucks. My husband and I stood in the kitchen for a long time without speaking. I want to pause here and be clear about something before I continue, because the next part is the part that ended any remaining possibility of coincidence for us. The part that made us understand we weren't dealing with imagination or pattern matching or selective memory or any of the other exits we'd been mentally keeping available. The boy had been calling himself a different name for about 3 weeks at that point. Not as pretend play, not the way kids name their stuffed animals or invent characters. He would correct us when we used his actual name. Calmly, not as a game. Just, "That's not my name." We'd asked what his name was. He'd told us. A name that meant nothing to us. An old name, not old-fashioned in the way that names cycle back into fashion, but genuinely old, the kind of name that belonged to a specific era and stopped being used. The police report my husband brought home listed the victim's name. It was the same name. Not similar. Not close. The same name, including a spelling variant that isn't standard. We did not sleep well that night. What happened next? And this is the part that I still cannot write about without my hands going a little unsteady, happened 2 days later. The boy walked to a section of the upstairs hallway we mostly used for storage, pressed both palms against the wall at a specific point, and said, "There's a door here." There was no door visible. It was a flat wall. We told him that. He looked at us with the specific patience of a child who is being misunderstood by adults and said, "It's behind. The door is behind." My husband got a stud finder, then a flashlight, then a pry bar. Behind approximately a 1/4 inch of drywall that had clearly been patched over at some point, we found a sealed cavity. Not a structural void. Not a mistake. A deliberate space, roughly 2 feet by 3, with a wooden backing that someone had put there intentionally, like a box in the wall. Inside there were 2 things. A child's shoe, leather, small, the kind of thing that would have belonged to a kid maybe 5 or 6 years old, from sometime mid-century based on the style, and a piece of folded paper. On it, in faded pencil handwriting, a name. The same name the boy had been calling himself. Not explained, not contextualized. Just the name written on its own, by someone who had sealed it into a wall in a house that a 4-year-old boy, 60-some years later, walked into like he already lived there. We left within the week. We did not tell the county. We did not contact researchers or journalists. I put the shoe in a box and the paper in the folder with the drawings, and I put the folder somewhere I don't look at often. The boy stopped talking about it the morning we drove away. We were 20 minutes down the highway, and I asked him, carefully, what he remembered about the house. He looked out the window at the passing fields and said, "Which house?" Like we'd lived in several. Like it was already gone from him. He has never mentioned the woman with the braid again. He has never used that other name again. He goes by his actual name now, corrects people who mispronounce it, signs his drawings with it at school. I still have the folder. I've opened it twice since we left. Both times I looked at the 11 drawings and then closed it again before I got to the photocopy. I don't know what my son knew in that house. I don't know if the word "know" is even the right word for it. I don't know if whatever it was belonged to him, or if the house just found the nearest available channel and used it. What I do know is this. Every parent thinks their kid is unusual. Every parent has moments where the child says something that stops them cold, and they file it away as one of those strange, beautiful moments that childhood makes. This was not that. This was something that had been waiting inside those walls for 60 years. And my son walked through the door and it recognized him. Approximately 1,810 words. Rehooks placed at the midsection. Now, I want you to stay with me here. Before the climax discovery, I want to pause here and be clear. And at the final stretch, what I do know is this. Each one different in mechanism. One is a direct address to skepticism. One is a personal credibility anchor. One is a closing philosophical reframe. None repeat each other's structure. He died on a Tuesday. The coffee on the kitchen counter was from a Thursday 3 weeks later. I want to be precise about this because precision is the only thing I have left. The mug was on the left side of the counter, which is where he always put it. Not in the sink, not in the cabinet, left side of the counter, handle facing the window the way he'd done it for 40 years in that house. The coffee inside was cold but not evaporated. Not the dried brown ring you get from something that's been sitting for months. Cold liquid. Recent. I stood there for about 30 seconds before I put my bag down. My father died on October 14th. I know the date the way you know the dates that split your life into before and after. The funeral was the 19th. I didn't go back to the house until November 9th, 3.5 weeks later, because I couldn't. Not because I was too grief-stricken to function, though that was also true, but because my father and I had not spoken in 14 months before he died. We had a falling out, the specific kind that middle-aged sons and stubborn fathers have, the kind where both people are partially right and neither will move first. He died before either of us moved. That was the thing that was eating me alive. Not the grief of losing him, though that was real. The grief of losing the version of him I hadn't let myself have yet. So when I finally drove the 3 hours to his house in November, I wasn't going to mourn. I was going there to pack, to be practical, to convert grief into boxes and donation bags because that felt more manageable than sitting still with it. The coffee stopped that plan entirely. I should tell you what kind of man my father was, because it matters for everything that comes after. He was not a dramatic person. He was not a person who left messes or let things go. Every morning of his life, every single morning, I can verify this from childhood through every visit I made as an adult, he washed his mug before 8 a.m. He did not leave dishes out. He did not leave things unfinished. The coffee sitting on the counter was not his habit. It was a violation of his character so complete that it registered to me before anything else in the house did. I set my bag down and I walked through every room. The heat was running. I'd assumed the utility autopay had kept it on. His finances were organized to a degree that embarrassed me. Everything automated, nothing dependent on someone remembering to pay a bill. So the heat made sense. But the temperature wasn't set to the usual 64 degrees. He kept it at in winter to save money. It was 71. His preferred temperature when he was home and comfortable. The television remote was on the arm of his chair. Not the side table where he stored it when he wasn't using it. On the arm, like he'd set it down mid-use. I started writing things down in my phone. I don't know exactly when I started doing that. I think sometime in the second room, but I was making a list without consciously deciding to. Coffee. Counter. Left side. Cold. Heat. 71. Remote. Chair arm. The list became the way I moved through the house. I was turning myself into a reporter covering a scene I didn't have the emotional vocabulary to cover as a son. The refrigerator had food in it. Not the food I'd have expected. Not the same groceries that would have been there in October, degraded and sad. Fresh food. An open container of the specific brand of yogurt he'd eaten every morning since his doctor told him to watch his cholesterol. A sell-by date of November 3rd, 3 weeks after he died. I closed the refrigerator and stood in the kitchen for a long time. Let me tell you the thing I was most afraid of, because I think it's important to be honest about this. I was afraid my father had not actually died when we thought he died. I was afraid there had been some administrative horror. A misidentification, a paperwork collapse, a mistake in a chain of events that I had trusted other people to manage because I couldn't be in the room myself. That terror of having buried the wrong person or having been told the wrong date, or of some grotesque gap between what I'd been told and what had actually happened, was sitting on my chest the entire time I moved through that house. I was not thinking ghost. I was thinking, what did I miss? What did I not do? I called the hospice facility. It took me 40 minutes to get a human being on the phone. They confirmed what I already knew. He had passed on October 14th. The paperwork was correct. The identification was correct. There was no error. I went back inside. There was a prescription bottle on the bathroom counter I hadn't noticed the first time through. I picked it up. His name, dated October 22nd, 8 days after his death. Filled at the pharmacy in town. I sat on the edge of the bathtub and looked at it for a while. Here is what I eventually understood, and I want you to follow this carefully because it took me weeks to construct the full picture from the pieces. My father had known he was dying for considerably longer than he had told anyone. He had been given a prognosis months before October. He had not shared it. Not with me, which given our estrangement made a brutal kind of sense, but not with anyone. Not his neighbor who checked on him. Not his doctor beyond the necessary appointments. He had decided, in the way that he decided everything, to manage it alone and on his terms. What the prescription bottle told me, what I confirmed later through phone calls I will spare you the details of, was that he had been filling prescriptions under a system that generated automatic refills. His doctor's office hadn't been notified of his death in time to stop the cycle. The pharmacy filled it on automation. No one had visited the house, but that still left the coffee, the fresh yogurt, the heat at 71. I found the answer in the last place I looked, which is always where answers hide. He had a neighbor, a woman in her 70s who lived a quarter-mile down the road, who had been quietly letting herself in with a key he'd given her years ago. She wasn't doing it out of confusion or denial. She knew he was gone. She had been coming to the house 3 times a week to sit in his chair for an hour or two. She told no one. She'd been keeping the heat where he liked it, drinking coffee in his kitchen. She'd been doing this for 3 weeks before I arrived, and she'd meant to stop before I came, and she hadn't gotten around to it. I found this out because she was there when I came back the second morning, sitting in his chair with her coat on. She looked at me without embarrassment and said, "I wasn't ready to let it be empty yet. I want to be honest about something." That explanation, when I got it, should have been comforting. It was a rational answer, a human answer, a sad and recognizable answer about grief and presence and the way people fill the spaces left by the dead. It should have closed the case. It didn't, because that night I was going through his phone. I'd been added to his account years ago, had the login, needed to cancel it, and I found a voicemail I had missed. Time-stamped October 13th, the night before he died. I had seen the missed call on my own phone at the time. I had not called back. We weren't speaking. I'd looked at his name on my screen and let it go to voicemail and told myself I'd deal with it when I was ready, when one of us had figured out how to be the one to go first. I put in my earbuds in the dark of his bedroom and I played it. His voice was clear. Not weak, not medicated slow the way I'd braced for. Just him. The voice I'd heard every day of my childhood, calling me by the shortened version of my name that only he ever used. He said, "I'm not ready yet. I'll call when I am." That was all. 12 seconds. He hung up. He never called again. I've replayed it 100 times trying to understand what he meant. Whether he was talking about the estrangement, that he wasn't ready to be the one to apologize and he'd call when he worked himself up to it. Whether he somehow knew that night was the last one and was saying something else entirely. Whether it was just a man who had been alone too long, leaving a message for a son who hadn't picked up, not knowing how to say anything real, so he said something that could mean whatever it needed to mean. I don't know. I will never know. He died the next morning. Alone in that house, in the room with the television remote on the arm of the chair, with the heat the way he liked it, on his terms, the way he did everything. What I know is that I didn't pick up. That's the part that keeps me up. Not the coffee, not the prescription, not the neighbor in his chair. Those all have explanations. They all resolve. The 12-second voicemail doesn't resolve. It just sits there in the dark. At the end of a call I chose not to answer, waiting for me to figure out what he was trying to say. I don't think I'm going to. We fell at 2:14 in the afternoon. I know because my watch cracked on impact and stopped. What I didn't know was that the person beside me had already decided only one of us needed to make it out. I want to start with the trail because the trail matters. We weren't doing anything reckless. This wasn't a pair of unprepared tourists who wandered off a marked path with bad shoes and worse judgment. We were experienced. We had the right gear, the right maps, the right everything. What we didn't have was knowledge of a sinkhole collapse that had opened sometime in the previous 72 hours on a section of trail that the Park Service hadn't gotten to yet. No marker, no rope, no warning. The ground just wasn't there anymore. The drop was maybe 20 feet. I hit a shelf of rock, rolled, came to rest on a dry sediment floor. I did a body check the way you do when your brain catches up to your body, fingers, toes, neck, breathing. Everything worked. My left ankle was wrong but weight-bearing. My pack had taken most of the impact on my back. I was okay. He landed about 8 feet from me. He was up before I was. That should have been reassuring. It wasn't, though I couldn't have told you why at the time. Just a flicker of something, a fraction of a second where his expression, before he saw that I was looking at him, was not the expression of a person who had just survived an accident together with someone they cared about. I filed it under shock. People look strange in shock. I was probably looking strange too. We assessed. One entrance above us, completely unreachable. The collapse had taken out any obvious handhold for at least 15 feet of vertical. Tunnel systems branching in 2 directions. No signal, which we'd both known was likely in this section of the park. We had between us 2 headlamps, one with fresh batteries, one about 40%. 2 water bottles, his full, mine about 2/3. Protein bars, maybe 6 between us, distributed between our packs. First aid kit. An emergency whistle that was useless underground. A lighter. He inventoried all of this out loud, which seemed like exactly the right thing to do. He was calm, methodical. He had a way of being calm in difficult situations that I had always found reassuring. It was part of why I trusted him for years, part of why I'd agreed to this trip in the first place. We picked the left tunnel because it angled slightly upward. We walked for about 40 minutes before it dead-ended at a wall of compacted rock. We went back to the drop point and tried the right tunnel. That one curved, curved again. We marked our path with the lighter, small scorch marks on the rock at every turn. His idea, a good one. We found a space wide enough to sit comfortably and we stopped. We needed to conserve the headlamps. We needed to think. He said, "Someone will notice we're not back by nightfall." I said, "That's 9 hours from now." He said, "Then we wait." We sat in the dark with one headlamp on low between us. We talked the way people talk when they're frightened and trying not to be, about nothing important, about the hike, about a restaurant we talked about trying when we got back to the city. Normal conversation used as scaffolding. I was grateful for it. I thought he was too. By what I estimated was hour 6. I was thirsty enough that I drank a significant portion of my remaining water. He watched me do it without saying anything. I asked if he wanted to split what was left between our bottles to even out the supply. He said he was fine, that I should keep mine, that we'd sort it out later. I thought that was generous. Write that down, because I want you to remember that I thought that was generous. By hour 9, I was tracking time by counting, a slow measured count I'd learned from a wilderness first aid course years back. I was rationing sips. My ankle had stiffened badly. I was running on the specific kind of tired that sits behind your eyes and makes everything slightly unreal. He had been quiet for a long time. I told myself he was conserving energy. He fell asleep before I did. Or he seemed to. He was on his side, back to me, breathing slow and even maybe 4 feet away in the dark. I don't know exactly what hour it was when he started talking in his sleep. I know it was late. I know I had been drifting in and out, and his voice pulled me back to full alert the way sounds do when your nervous system is already primed. He wasn't saying words at first. Just the rhythm of speech, the cadence of a person working through a problem in their head. Then it sharpened. I'm not going to give you a dramatic reconstruction of every sentence because I only caught fragments, and I think fragments are actually more honest. What I heard, clearly, in a voice that was his voice but without any of the social architecture people put over their real thoughts, was this: "Less wait, 2 days, maybe 3. A pause. If she can't keep up. A longer pause. Only one way out anyway." I did not move. I want to be honest about the next few minutes because they're important. I lay completely still and I ran every charitable interpretation I could construct. He was dreaming. He was processing fear. He was talking about the situation abstractly, not about me specifically. The word she could mean anything in a dream. People say irrational things in their sleep. I ran all of those and then I thought about the water. He had a full bottle when we landed. He had offered me nothing from it in 9 hours. He had watched me drain mine and suggested I keep it, which meant he'd already done the math, already understood that I would run out first, and had decided not to prevent that. I thought about the inventory he'd done out loud immediately after we fell, how quickly and completely he'd cataloged everything, before I'd even fully gotten my bearings. I thought about how he'd been the one to choose the tunnels, the one to set the pace, the one to pick where we stopped. I thought about the expression on his face in that first half second after we landed. I want to stop here and tell you something honestly, because I think you deserve it. This is the part of the story that I've gone back and forth on the most. The part where I wonder if I built a case out of fear and exhaustion and ambient darkness and a few sleeping words that might have meant nothing. I've had 4 years to second-guess this. For years to ask myself whether I misheard, misread, projected. But here is what I keep coming back to. I changed my behavior based on what I heard, and I'm alive. That's the only data point I have that feels solid. I did not go back to sleep. I waited until his breathing had been slow and even for what felt like 30 minutes. Then I took my pack, my headlamp, the one with the better battery, and I retraced our marked path back to the drop point alone. My ankle screamed the entire way. I didn't care. At the drop point, I found something we had both missed in the initial assessment, a section of the collapsed wall, off to the right of the main drop, where the rock had come down in chunks large enough to use as footholds. Not obvious. Not easy. Painful on my ankle in ways I don't fully want to describe. But climbable. I came out of the ground at approximately 6 a.m., based on the light. I flagged down a Park Service vehicle on the access road within 20 minutes. I told them there was another person in the cave system. I told them he was asleep and hadn't been injured. I did not tell them what I heard. Not then. Not to the police when they followed up. Not to the journalists who ran the story, because they did run the story, a brief one. 2 hikers rescued from unmapped cave collapse, everyone fine, Park Service reviewing trail markers. He gave an interview about 10 days later. I watched it on my phone. He talked about how frightened he'd been, how the darkness does something to your sense of time, how moments like that remind you what actually matters. He said he woke up and I was gone and he didn't know what to think. He said it with the right amount of emotion. He was very good. A woman in the comments section called him brave. I haven't spoken to him since the Park Service pulled him out. I've thought about it. I picked up the phone, put it down, written messages I deleted. I've had the version of the conversation in my head where I ask him directly and he explains it, and it all dissolves into a misunderstanding born from a dark cave and an exhausted mind. But then I think about his water bottle, still mostly full when they brought him out. 9 hours underground, under physical and psychological stress, and he'd barely touched it. I think about that a lot. I think about how calmly a person can do math about another person's survival when they believe no one is listening. The cave didn't scare me. The dark didn't scare me. The thing that scared me was understanding, in the 28th hour underground, that the most dangerous thing in that tunnel had walked in with me, and it had my friend's face. Every journalist has a story they never published. This is mine. I didn't file it because I wasn't sure anyone would believe me, and because I wasn't sure I'd be believed alive long enough to matter. I need to give you some context before I give you the town, and I need to tell you up front that I'm not giving you the town. Not the name, not the state, not even the region. I've thought carefully about how much to share, and this is where I've landed. Enough that you understand what happened, not enough that anyone reading this can draw a straight line back to me. If that frustrates you, I understand. Frustrates me too. But I've been living with this for 3 years, and I've made my peace with telling the partial version rather than the full version and not being findable afterward. I was sent there to investigate a missing persons pattern. 3 people in 7 years. Not a dramatic number on the surface. Small enough that it hadn't attracted serious attention from anyone outside the county. But the assignment editor had noticed something in the data that most people missed. All 3 had been tourists. All 3 had arrived alone. All 3 had checked into the same bed and breakfast. And all 3 had, according to the last people who saw them, visited the public library the day before they disappeared. The library detail was what got me on a bus. The town was small in the way that certain coastal towns are small. Not struggling, not dying, but sealed. The kind of place that has been exactly the same size for 100 years and seems to prefer it that way. 2 streets of storefronts, a harbor, a cannery that still ran, a church with a full parking lot on weekdays. People nodded at me when I walked past. Not warmly, the kind of nod that means, "We see you, we know you're not from here, we are noting your presence." I checked into the bed and breakfast, the same one, because if there's a thread you pull it, and spent the first day doing what journalists do when they don't want to announce themselves. I walked around and bought things and talked to people about nothing. Coffee at the diner. A newspaper from the shop on the corner. A conversation about the weather with a man repairing a boat on the harbor wall. Normal, small-town texture. Friendly enough on the surface. But underneath the friendliness there was something I can only describe as unanimity. Everyone had the same temperature. Not robotic, not scripted, but calibrated in a way that felt less like a personality and more like a policy. Nobody complained about anything. Nobody gossiped. Nobody said anything negative about any other person in the town. In 7 hours of casual conversation with probably 12 different people, I did not hear a single person express a dissatisfying opinion about a single aspect of their community. I've covered a lot of small towns. I've never been anywhere where everyone was that satisfied. That night in my room, I wrote in my notebook, unanimity. Check if cult, check if fear, check if both. I went to the library on the second morning. The librarian was a woman in her 60s, small and precise, with the kind of organized stillness that comes from decades of managing a space that depends on quiet. She was helpful. She answered my questions about local history with exactly the right amount of detail. Not so much that it felt like a performance, not so little that it raised a flag. She showed me the local history section. She pointed me toward a shelf of bound newsletters from the Historical Society. I asked, after about 40 minutes of this, whether there was a founding ledger. A lot of towns this age kept one, I said. Property records, original deeds, community agreements. Was there anything like that on file? The change was small. If I hadn't been watching for it, if I hadn't spent the previous 7 hours cataloging the surface texture of this town, I might have missed it entirely. Her hands, which had been moving steadily across the desk as she talked, went still. Not tense, just still. The way a person goes still when they are deciding something. She smiled and said the founding documents were currently unavailable. Being archived. She wasn't sure of the timeline. She'd be happy to take my name and contact me when they were accessible again. I told her not to worry about it. I said it casually, like it didn't matter. I left the library and walked back to the bed and breakfast and sat on the edge of the bed and thought about the 3 people who had been here before me, who had asked, apparently, the same question, who had been given, presumably, the same answer, who had not gone home. Here is the thing I need you to understand about what I did next, because I've had people ask me since whether it was reckless, whether I should have left at that point, whether a sensible person would have walked to their car and driven away. Yes, probably, a sensible person would have. But I had a notebook with 3 names in it and a library card I'd requested under a false pretense and a conviction that the story was real, and journalists in that specific emotional state do not make entirely sensible decisions. We make documented ones. I went back to the library at 7 p.m., an hour after it closed. The door was unlocked. I want to say that clearly. I did not break in. The door was unlocked, which told me something I filed away immediately. The founding ledger was not in the archive room. It was not in the back office. It was in the reading room on the center table, as if someone had left it out. As if someone had known I was coming back and wanted me to find it without any remaining barrier between me and the thing I'd been asking about. I've thought about that a lot since. Whether it was a trap or an invitation, or whether, at a certain point in a town like that, there is no meaningful difference between the two. The ledger was old. Real old. The binding was hand-sewn. The earliest pages brittle at the edges. The ink faded to the color of old tea. The first entry was dated 1887. Property transfers, community agreements, founding signatures. Normal historical record. I turned pages. Somewhere around 1910 the entries changed character. Less administrative. More, I don't have a better word for it, liturgical. The language shifted. It started referring to something called the compact. No definition. No explanation. Just references to it, the way a document refers to an agreement that everyone present already understands. Every generation, a name was added to a list at the back of the ledger. The list had a heading. The heading was 2 words. I'm not going to write them here. I've made that decision and I'm keeping it. The names went back to 1887. 1 per generation, sometimes 2 if the gap was long. Next to each name, a date. The dates were not birth dates. I cross-referenced the first few against the Historical Society newsletters I'd read that afternoon. The dates were death dates. Every single one. The most recent entry was dated 3 weeks before my visit. I didn't recognize the name. I've looked for it since. I've never found a person by that name with any connection to the town, which tells me either the name was false or the person was the kind of person who doesn't leave a searchable trace, which is to say, a person like the 3 missing tourists who arrived alone and were not from there. And then below that entry, below the most recent death date, below the most recent name, there was a blank line. The blank line where the next name would go. Above the blank line, written in fresh ink, in handwriting that was not the same as the historical entries. Newer, more deliberate, the handwriting of someone who had written it recently and carefully, was a name. My name. Not my byline. Not the name I checked in under. My actual name. The name on my driver's license, the name my mother uses, the name that exists in no public record connected to this assignment or this town. I closed the ledger. I walked out of the library. I did not go back to the bed and breakfast. I did not collect my bag. I walked to the end of the main street and turned away from the harbor and kept walking until I hit the county road, and then I walked the county road for 4 miles until a truck stopped and the driver, a man who was not from the town I asked twice, gave me a ride to the nearest bus station. I filed nothing. I told my editor I'd followed the lead and found nothing substantial, that the missing persons pattern was probably coincidence and county roads and tourists who didn't tell their families their itineraries. She accepted this. She moved me to another story. I've thought about the 3 names in my notebook every week since then. I've thought about what I owe them. I've had entire conversations with myself about whether silence is complicity, whether protection is cowardice, whether there is a version of this story I could tell that would change something. I haven't found that version yet. What I know is that someone in that town knew my real name before I arrived. What I know is that the door was unlocked and the ledger was on the table and my name was already written down in ink that was dry. They weren't waiting to see if I'd come. They already knew I would. The only thing they hadn't accounted for was that I'd leave without my bag. I think about that a lot. Whether the unlocked door was confidence or carelessness. Whether somewhere in that town there is a ledger open to a blank line that has been waiting 3 years for a date to go next to my name. I don't let myself think about it for too long. Some doors you walk out of and you just keep walking and you don't look back and you don't count how many steps it takes before you stop feeling like you're still inside. I'm still counting. She wasn't confused. She wasn't grieving in the wrong direction. She had written down the dates, the times, and exactly what he said, and every single one of them checked out. I am telling this story because my mother cannot tell it herself anymore. She passed 2 years ago, quietly, in the same house where all of this happened, in the town where she spent 61 years of her life. She left me the house, the furniture, a ceramic rooster she'd kept on the kitchen windowsill since before I was born, and a shortwave radio that my father built by hand in 1963 in the garage of their first apartment. The radio is sitting in my living room right now. It is unplugged. It has been unplugged since the night I heard it myself. I want to start with who my father was, because the kind of person he was is inseparable from why any of this matters. He was an engineer, not the romantic kind, not a builder of bridges or a dreamer of large systems, but the quiet, precise kind who spent 30 years calibrating industrial equipment and found genuine satisfaction in things that worked exactly as they should. He was not a superstitious man. He did not believe in anything he couldn't measure. He built the radio as a hobby project in the early years of their marriage, tuned it himself, taught my mother how to operate it, and kept it running with small repairs for decades the way some people maintain a garden, out of love for the process, not the product. He died in the winter. Cardiac event. Fast, no warning. He was there and then he wasn't, the way it happens when it happens like that. My mother was 71. They had been married for 47 years. She did not fall apart the way people expected her to. She got quiet instead. A particular quality of quiet that I now understand was not the absence of feeling but the presence of something she hadn't figured out how to name yet. The first transmission came 6 weeks after his funeral. She called me that evening. I was living 4 hours away at the time, visiting on weekends when I could, and her voice had something in it I hadn't heard before. Not distress. Something closer to the way a person sounds when they have seen something that rearranged the furniture of their understanding and they are still standing in the room deciding how to feel about the new layout. She said, the radio had turned on by itself, and she had heard his voice. I did what any reasonable adult child does in that situation. I made gentle noises of acknowledgement. I asked if she'd been sleeping enough. I suggested that grief does strange things to perception, that the brain in morning reaches for the familiar, that she should call me anytime, that I'd come up the following weekend. I was kind about it. I was also, without saying so directly, filing it under the category of things that happen when someone very old loses the person they built their entire life around. I want to stop here and tell you something I mean completely sincerely. I was wrong to do that. Not because I was unkind, I don't think I was unkind, but because I had already decided the answer before I'd looked at the evidence. And the evidence, when I finally looked at it, did not fit the answer I'd decided on. She kept a notebook. This is the part that matters most, and I need you to understand what kind of woman my mother was before you hear this. She was a bookkeeper for 30 years. She balanced accounts, tracked figures, maintained records with the specific discipline of a person who understood that the difference between a written number and a remembered number is the difference between fact and approximation. When she told me she had written down the dates and times and contents of every transmission, she didn't mean she jotted some notes. She meant she had a log, dated, timed, annotated. By the time I took it seriously enough to drive up and look at the notebook, there were 19 entries spanning 4 months. Each entry listed a date, a time, a duration, and a summary of what was said. The voice. She never wavered on this, never qualified it, never said it sounded like him or reminded her of him. Was his voice. Not approximate. The specific cadence of a man who had spent decades explaining technical things to non-technical people. Measured and clear with occasional dry humor that appeared nowhere in his personality except when he was comfortable. The contents of the transmissions were not emotional. They were not declarations of love from beyond. They were not the things a grieving widow would construct if she were constructing something. They were practical, informational. He told her the boiler in the basement was running at the wrong pressure and would fail before spring. He told her the neighbor 2 doors down had fallen and wasn't telling anyone. He told her there was a problem with the title on the house that had been filed incorrectly in 1987 and would cause difficulty for whoever inherited it. Every single one of these things was verifiable. Every single one of them was true. The boiler failed in March. The neighbor had a fractured wrist she'd been hiding from her family. The title error was real. I found it myself when I started going through the estate paperwork, buried in a county record amendment that would have been a significant legal problem if we hadn't known to look for it. He had been giving her a maintenance list. Practical, precise, and accurate. Which is to say, he had been exactly himself. I drove up the weekend after I read the full notebook and I sat with my mother at the kitchen table and I asked her to explain the radio to me from the beginning. She walked me through it without drama. When it had first happened, what she'd done, how she'd verified the signal frequency, how she'd checked whether it was a neighbor's transmission or a broadcast bleed from somewhere else. She had already done the rational investigation. She had already ruled out the obvious explanations with the same methodical patience she'd applied to 30 years of accounts. She wasn't asking me to believe her. She was presenting the record and letting it speak. I asked her if she was frightened. She thought about it for a moment, genuinely thought about it in the way she did when she was being precise, and said no. She said it felt less like something supernatural and more like something structural, like a frequency that had always existed and they'd simply never had a reason to tune to it before. I stayed that weekend. Saturday night, around 11. I was reading in the kitchen while she slept and I heard the radio. It was in the back room. A small room my father had used as a workspace that my mother had kept exactly as he'd left it. Tools on the pegboard, manuals stacked on the shelf, the radio on its own table against the wall. The door was open. The sound came through clearly. Static first. The specific texture of shortwave static, which is different from other static, wider, more oceanic, like something breathing. And then through it, his voice. He said my name. The shortened version, the one he'd used since I was a child, that no one else used exactly the way he did, the particular note he put on the second syllable that was his alone. He said, "There are things your mother didn't tell you about the title issue. The amendment has a secondary clause. Check the 1987 filing, not just the correction. You'll need it." Then the static widened again and he was gone. I sat completely still for a long time. Then I got up and I walked to the back room and I stood in the doorway and I looked at the radio. It was unplugged. The cord was coiled on the floor beside the table, not connected to anything. I checked the wall socket. Empty. I checked for a battery compartment. There wasn't one. It was a mains-only unit my father had built specifically for wall power. There was no power source in the room that I could identify. I went back to the kitchen and I sat down and I wrote in my mother's notebook. Entry 20. My name. date, time, duration, content. I did not wake her. I let her sleep. In the morning, I told her what had happened, and she listened and nodded and poured me coffee and said, "I know. He told me you'd hear it eventually. He said you needed to be ready first." I checked the 1987 filing the following week. The secondary clause was there. It would have cost me considerably in probate if I hadn't known to look. I found an estate attorney, addressed it before my mother passed, and the inheritance transferred without the problem it would otherwise have caused. That's the part one can prove. The part one can put a document next to and say, "This was real, this was accurate, this had consequences that I can trace with paperwork." The part one can't prove is the voice, the unplugged cord, the frequency that carried something from somewhere I don't have a name for, through a radio my father built with his own hands in 1963, to a back room in a small house where his wife sat alone in her grief and wrote down every word in a notebook with a blue cover because she was a bookkeeper and she understood that unmeasured things have a way of disappearing. She died 2 years after that night. I was with her when she went. She was calm. She didn't say anything dramatic. In the last hour, she turned her head toward the window twice, the same direction as the back room, with an expression I had seen on her face only once before. The night she first heard the radio. The radio is in my living room, unplugged. I keep it on because she kept it on, and because some part of me that I can't argue with believes that if the cord was not what was carrying the signal before, then the cord being out means nothing either way. I haven't heard it again. I'm not sure if that means it's finished, or if it means I'm not ready yet. I didn't find the bodies. I want to be clear about that from the start, because the way the story sounds when I tell it makes people assume I walked into something physical and visible and undeniable. I didn't. What I found was a spreadsheet, and somehow that was worse. I was 23. First job out of university, hired as a data entry clerk for a private medical facility. The kind of place that exists in certain parts of the world where money and medicine share a waiting room and the walls are very clean and nobody asks too many questions about the financial architecture underneath. I was grateful to have the job. I was good at it. I came in at 10 p.m. and left at 6 a.m. and I entered figures into forms and I did not think very hard about what the figures meant because that was not what I was paid to think about. I want you to hold that sentence. I was not paid to think about what the figures meant. I have held it myself every day for 4 years and I am still not done with it. The night it started, I was 7 months into the job. Nothing unusual about the shift, same corridor, same desk, same login screen, same stack of patient discharge forms to process before morning. The facility handled roughly 40 to 60 discharges a week. My job was to take the paper forms, enter the patient ID, the date, the attending physician code, the discharge destination, and mark the record closed. 8 fields per form, 40 to 60 forms per night. It was not complicated work. It was the kind of work that becomes automatic quickly, which is exactly the kind of work that is most dangerous when something inside it is wrong. At around 2 a.m., I made a data entry error. I typed a patient ID 1 digit off and the system pulled up the wrong record. Standard mistake, easy to catch, and I caught it immediately. I corrected the ID, closed the wrong record, moved on. But before I closed it, I saw the name. I had processed this patient before. I knew because the system flagged duplicate entries and I had a memory for flags. It was the only interesting thing that happened in an 8-hour shift, when the system pushed back. I had discharged this patient 6 weeks earlier. Discharge destination listed as home, physician code confirmed, record closed. Standard. But the record I had accidentally pulled up was a current record. Active. The patient was listed as in facility. Ward 7. Bed 4. As of that night, I stared at it for a moment. Then I closed it and corrected my entry and finished my stack and went home. I told myself it was a clerical error somewhere above me. Duplicate records happened. Systems had glitches. I was 23 and I needed the job, and the corridor at 2 a.m. is not a place that encourages you to follow threads. I followed the thread anyway. Not that night, 3 nights later, when the thing I'd seen had been sitting at the back of my mind long enough that ignoring it started to feel like a decision rather than an oversight. I ran the patient ID deliberately this time. The active record was still there. Ward 7, Bed 4. 6 weeks after I had processed the discharge. I ran the discharge record I had originally filed. It was there too. Both records existed simultaneously in the system. The discharge record was clean, all 8 fields complete, physician code valid, destination confirmed. The active record showed ongoing treatment notes, medication logs, vital sign entries. Someone was updating it regularly. Someone who did not know or did not care that this patient had officially left the building 6 weeks ago. I need you to understand what the inside of my head was like at this point, because I think it matters for everything that comes after. I was not thinking sinister conspiracy. I was thinking administrative failure. I was thinking someone had forgotten to close a record, or a physician was updating the wrong file, or there had been a readmission that hadn't been properly linked to the existing patient profile. These are the explanations a person reaches for when they work inside a system and the system has always appeared functional and they are sitting alone in a corridor at 2 a.m. with a job they cannot afford to lose. Rational explanations are very comfortable until they run out. I ran 4 more patient IDs from my recent discharge stack. I picked them at random. 3 came back clean. Discharge record only, no active file, exactly what the system should show. The 4th came back the same way as the first. 2 records. Discharged 6 weeks ago. Currently in facility, Ward 7. 2 patients. Both officially gone. Both apparently still there. Here is where I have to tell you something about myself that I am not proud of, because this story does not make sense without it. I did not report what I had found. Not that night, not the following week. I kept coming in at 10 p.m. I kept processing my stack. I kept entering 8 fields per form, 40 to 60 forms per night, and I kept the 2 anomalous patient IDs in a note on my personal phone, and I told myself I was gathering more information before I did anything, which is a very reasonable-sounding way of describing the thing I was actually doing, which was nothing. I was afraid. Not of something I could name, not yet. Just the low structural fear of a young person in a first job who has seen something they were not supposed to see and understands instinctively that the act of having seen it has already changed their position in ways they cannot fully map. Over the next 3 weeks, I found 6 more. 8 patients total. All discharged in my records. All showing active treatment files in a ward that, when I eventually walked past it during a shift, I had no reason to go to Ward 7. I was admin, not clinical, was dark. Locked. A ward that the facility map listed as currently under renovation and not in use. A ward with 8 patients in its system, updating regularly, in a building where that ward did not officially exist. I want to stop here because I think you have probably already understood something that took me considerably longer to understand, and I want to be honest about the gap between what the evidence was telling me and when I allowed myself to hear it. The evidence had been telling me for 3 weeks. I had been finding reasons to refile it under administrative error, under system anomaly, under anything that did not require me to consider what it meant that a locked and used ward had 8 patients in it whose discharge paperwork I had personally signed off on. My signature, my employee ID, 8 fields per form, 8 patients, all officially gone, none of them gone. I had been the mechanism. That was what I finally understood sitting at my desk at 3 a.m. on a Wednesday in the 3rd week. Not a witness. Not a discoverer. The mechanism. Whoever had built this system had needed someone to process the outgoing paperwork cleanly, quickly, without curiosity. They had hired a 23-year-old on a night shift who was good at data entry and grateful for the work. They had given me exactly the access I needed and none of the access that would have shown me what I was doing. For 8 months, I had been closing records on people who had not been discharged. I do not know what happened to those people. I want to say that plainly because I think it is the most important sentence in this story. I do not know. I have constructed possibilities in the years since, and I have put all of them down because living with possibilities is worse than living with the absence of an answer, and at some point you choose the version of not knowing that lets you function. What I know is what I did next. I copied the patient IDs, the record timestamps, the physician codes, and the ward assignment data to a personal drive. I processed my remaining stack for the night. I clocked out at 6 a.m. as usual. I did not go back. I sent the data to a journalist, not someone I knew, someone I found, someone who wrote about private medical institutions and had a contact form on their website. I sent it anonymously from an account I made that morning and deleted that afternoon. I do not know if they investigated. I have searched for the facility's name in news archives every few months since and found nothing. Either nothing was published or nothing was found or something happened that made publishing impossible. I think about those 8 names regularly. Not constantly, I have learned that constantly is not survivable, but regularly. The way you think about a door you passed and didn't open and will never be able to go back to. I was not paid to think about what the figures meant. I know that now. I understood it the moment I understood what I had been processing. They had not hired me despite the fact that I would not ask questions. They had hired me because of it. My incuriosity was the product. My clean, quiet efficiency at 2 a.m. in an empty corridor was exactly the tool the system needed. I have a different job now. I ask questions constantly. My colleagues find it exhausting. I do not explain why I do it. Some of them probably think I am difficult. I think about what it costs to become difficult. I think it was worth it. I think about the 8 names and I think it was the very least that it was worth. Every light in the building was off except mine. I had noticed this gradually over the first 2 days, the way you notice a change in temperature, not as a single moment but as an accumulation of small confirmations until the fact of it becomes impossible to ignore. The dormitory had 6 floors, 48 rooms. When the winter break began and the other students left, the building had gone dark floor by floor the way a town goes dark when a storm takes out the grid, working inward from the edges. By the 3rd night of break, I was the only lit window in the building. Possibly the only lit window on the entire campus block. I knew this because I had looked. I was 19. I was studying engineering on a scholarship that required me to maintain a grade average that I was, at that point, 2 exams behind on. Everyone else had gone home for the break. I had no home to go to, not in the country I was in, and the flight back to where I was from cost more than I had. So I stayed. The university allowed it. The dormitory administrator gave me a key to the laundry room and told me the heating would be on reduced schedule after midnight and wished me a good holiday with the specific brisk kindness of a person who is about to leave and does not want to feel bad about leaving. I was fine with it. I want to be honest about that because the story makes more sense if you understand I was not a frightened person going in. I was a practical person, slightly behind on my coursework, grateful for 2 weeks of uninterrupted quiet in a building with fast internet and no social obligations. I had food, I had deadlines, I had absolutely no expectation that anything would happen. The first 2 days were exactly as uneventful as I had anticipated. I studied, I slept, I made tea at odd hours. I was in the specific way of students who are catching up on work they should have done months earlier, almost content. The 3rd night, I heard a door close on the floor below mine. Single sound. Clean. The specific sound of a dormitory door, heavy fire door weight. The click of a latch engaging. I heard it clearly because the building was otherwise completely silent, the kind of silence that only exists in institutional buildings when the people have been removed from them, a silence with a texture to it, almost pressurized. I sat still for a moment. Then I went back to my textbook. Dormitories make sounds. Old buildings settle. Pipes move. Latches that aren't fully engaged release on their own. I had spent 2 days alone in this building and it had been making sounds the entire time. The heating system cycling on and off, the elevator moving for no apparent reason, the particular groan of the stairwell when the temperature outside dropped. One door sound at 11 at night was not something I needed to think about. I thought about it for the rest of the evening. Not obsessively. Just the way a sound that doesn't belong sits in the back of your mind and knocks occasionally while you're trying to focus on something else. At around 1 a.m., I walked to my window and looked down at the floor below. 3 windows. All dark. I told myself, maintenance worker, building check, someone doing exactly the kind of institutional task that happens in empty buildings while the people who normally occupy them are away. I told myself this and I believed it and I went to sleep. The following night, same time, I heard 2 doors. Same floor, perhaps 20 minutes apart. Here is where I need to ask you to make a specific imaginative effort, because the thing that made this frightening was not dramatic and I don't want to overdress it. It was simply spatial. 2 doors on the floor below me on consecutive nights, in a building that was officially empty. That's the whole of it. No sound of footsteps, no voices, just the sound of rooms being entered and presumably exited. 2 rooms occupied for a period of time I could not determine, on a floor directly beneath mine. I checked the floor below the following morning. Walked the entire corridor in daylight, which felt like the rational thing to do. Verify in the light what the dark had made strange. All doors closed. No sign of occupation in the corridor. I tried 3-door handles and they were all locked, which meant whoever had been in those rooms had a key, which meant it was either a staff member or someone with unauthorized access to staff keys, and I spent approximately 1 corridor length deciding which of those 2 possibilities I preferred and landed firmly on staff member and went back upstairs. That night I heard doors on the floor below and 1 door on my floor. My floor. The same floor I was on. A door that I had not heard on any of the previous nights. In a building where I was the only registered occupant. In a wing where every room except mine was locked. I sat at my desk and I did not move for a long time. I want to tell you exactly what I thought in those minutes because I think it is important to be precise about the difference between fear and assessment. What I felt was not panic. It was the cold, specific alertness of a person who has just understood that the thing they have been explaining away for 3 nights has changed in a way that their explanations no longer cover. Someone had been working their way up through this building. Floor by floor, room by room, getting closer to the only occupied room in the structure in a way that was either coincidental or was not, and I had just that night run out of available coincidence. I sent a message to the dormitory administrator, explained what I'd heard, asked whether maintenance was scheduled. Got a reply the following morning. No maintenance scheduled during break period. Building should be unoccupied except for me. Was I sure I had heard correctly? I was sure. The administrator said she would ask the facilities team to check the building. She said this with the tone of someone managing an anxious student rather than someone taking a security concern seriously. I recognized the tone. I did not push back against it because I was 19 and I had been trained by 19 years of life to not push back against institutional tones. I pushed back anyway. I sent a second message. I listed the nights, the floors, the number of doors, the progression. I used the word progression deliberately because I wanted her to see what I was seeing, that this was not random building noise, that there was a direction to it, that the direction was upward and the destination was obvious. She called the facilities team that day. 2 men came in the afternoon with a master key. I walked the building with them, all 6 floors, every corridor. Nothing disturbed. No sign of unauthorized entry. Every external door secure. No broken locks, no propped windows, nothing. They were kind about it. They checked twice. They found nothing. That night I pushed my desk against my door and did not sleep. At 3 a.m. I heard my door handle move. Not a knock. Not a voice. The handle, depressed slowly, the way you depress a handle when you are trying to determine whether a door is locked without making noise. It moved down, met the resistance of the desk, and released. Once. Then silence. I called the emergency line for the dormitory from my phone. A security guard arrived in 11 minutes, I counted. He searched the floor. He found nothing. He stood in my doorway and looked at a 19-year-old student who had pushed a desk against his door and he said, not unkindly, sometimes these old buildings, the pressure changes make the handles move on their own. I looked at him. He said, do you want me to stay on the floor until morning? I said yes. He stayed. Nothing else happened that night. In the morning, I packed a bag and spent the remaining 9 days of break on the floor of a classmate's apartment in the city, sleeping on a couch, which was the best sleep I had in weeks. The facilities team did a full security audit of the dormitory after I reported everything formally in writing. They found one thing, a secondary entrance in the basement, a maintenance access point that connected to a utility corridor running beneath the building that had been opened from the inside at some point during the break period. Not forced. Opened with knowledge of how it worked. Someone had been inside the building who knew the building well enough to enter through a door that was not on the standard security checklist. Who it was, why they were working their way upward through the rooms, what they would have done if my door had not been held by a desk. I do not know. The university did not tell me if they found anything further. I asked twice and received administrative language both times and eventually stopped asking because some institutions are better at processing liability than truth. I finished my degree. I went home. I have never stayed alone in a large empty building since, which sounds like a small and manageable life adjustment until you understand that I think about those 9 minutes with the door handle every time I am in any building after hours, alone, with all the lights off except mine. If you are reading this and you are the kind of person who stays behind when everyone else goes home, the scholarship student, the one without the flight money, the one who finds the quiet useful, I am not saying don't stay. I am saying push something against your door. I am saying count the lights in the other windows before you decide you are alone. She called it the other sleep, and she said it the way you say the name of a place you have been to and miss. Not with fear, not with dread, but with a specific quiet longing that was worse than either. My sister was 3 years younger than me. I want to use the past tense carefully here because she is not dead. I need you to know that before anything else, because the story has a shape that might make you assume otherwise. She is alive. She lives in a city I am not going to name, in an apartment I have not been to, and she has asked me not to contact her, and I am respecting that. And the grief of that is its own thing, separate from everything I am about to tell you, but not entirely separable either. We shared an apartment for 2 years. This was her idea. She had moved to the city for graduate school. I was already there. It made financial sense, and we had always been close in the way that sisters with a small age gap are close, which is to say, entirely with the specific intensity of people who have known each other longer than they have known themselves. The first time it happened, I was not there. She told me about it the following morning over coffee, the way you tell someone about a strange dream, with a kind of bemused detachment, as if the experience belonged to a slightly different version of yourself. She said she had woken in the night, or had almost woken, had arrived at the border of consciousness without crossing it, and had stayed there. Not paralyzed. She was clear about this distinction and returned to it every time she described the experience. She was not frozen. She was suspended, held at the threshold by something that felt, she said, deliberate. I said, that's sleep paralysis. It's common, it's neurological, it passes. She nodded and drank her coffee and said, yes, probably. But she said it the way people say yes, probably, when they already know it isn't. The second time happened 3 weeks later. This time I was home. I heard nothing. She made no sound, did not call out, did not move in any way that carried through the wall between our rooms. In the morning she came to breakfast with the notebook she used for her research, and she read to me, without preamble, a detailed description of the building across the street from our apartment. 3rd floor, specific window, the way the light came through at a particular angle between 3 and 4 a.m. A plant on the windowsill she described as a large-leaf trailing variety in a terracotta pot that had been moved recently from one side of the sill to the other. I looked out our kitchen window at the building across the street. 3rd floor, specific window, a large-leaf trailing plant in a terracotta pot. She had not been at that window during the night. I would have heard her cross the apartment. She had been in her room, in the other sleep, seeing something she had no physical line of sight to. I need to stop here and tell you honestly that my first response was not fear. My first response was the particularly uncomfortable feeling of a person who has given a confident rational explanation and been quietly shown that the explanation was wrong. Sleep paralysis does not produce accurate external observations. Sleep paralysis is a perceptual event, internal, generated by a brain in a specific state. It does not show you the neighbor's plant from an angle you cannot physically access. Whatever was happening to my sister, I had named it incorrectly, and in doing so had made her feel, probably, slightly alone in it. I thought about that for a long time afterward. Over the following year it happened more often. Every 2 weeks, then weekly, then sometimes twice in a week. The experiences followed a consistent pattern. The threshold, the suspension, the observation, the return. She always came back with something specific and external, something she described with the flat accuracy of a person reporting measurements. Not visions, not imagery, not the symbolic language of dreams. Information. The neighbor's schedule, the water stain appearing on the building facade 3 days before it was visible from street level. The precise configuration of a room in an apartment she had no access to. Every item verifiable. Every item accurate. What changed, and this is the part one want to describe carefully because it is the part that shifted everything for me, was her relationship to the threshold itself. In the early months she returned from it the way you return from a place you went involuntarily, with a slight relief at being back, with the residue of something unfamiliar that needed a moment to settle. By the end of the first year she did not have that residue anymore. She came back the way you come back from somewhere you chose to go, settled, satisfied. Sometimes, when I watched her face in the morning after a night she'd been in the other sleep, There was an expression I had no word for, a quality of having been somewhere more real than here, a faint reluctance about the return that she never said out loud but that sat on her face clearly enough that I started watching for it the way you watch someone you love for the signs of something you cannot name. I asked her once, directly, whether she was afraid of it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "At first I was. But it never does anything harmful. It just shows me things." She paused and looked at her coffee cup and said, "I think it wants me to see clearly. I think it wants me to see clearly." I have turned that sentence over so many times. The grammar of it, the subject, the verb, the implication of intention on the part of something she was spending a significant portion of her nights inside. By the time she said it to me, she had been going into the other sleep for 14 months. She spoke about it the way someone speaks about a practice, a discipline, something she had gotten better at. The night that ended things between us, she came to my room at 2 a.m. and sat on the edge of my bed and woke me. I had not seen her do this since we were children. She looked entirely calm. She said she needed to tell me something she had seen. She said it was about me, about something coming for me, a specific event, a thing I needed to know before it arrived. She told me what she had seen. I am not going to put it in this video. I have thought about whether to share it and I have decided not to, and I want to explain why because I think the reason matters. What she described has not happened yet. It may not happen. It may be the product of whatever the other sleep is, something that shows real things accurately but not necessarily truthfully in the way that matters. I do not know. What I know is that she told me this thing at 2 a.m. with complete calm certainty, and then went back to her room and I lay in the dark for the rest of the night, and something between us had changed in a way that neither of us knew how to change back. We managed another 3 months as roommates. We did not talk about what she had told me. We talked about everything else. Her research, my work, dinner, the news, all the normal surface of a shared life. But underneath it, the thing she had said was there every day, and I think she knew I was thinking about it, and I think she found my inability to simply accept it and move on, the way she had moved on, past fear into something else, frustrating in a way she couldn't fully articulate. She moved out in the spring. She said it was for practical reasons. We both understood it wasn't. She asked me not to contact her about the other sleep. I agreed. Then I broke the agreement once, 6 months later, in a message I sent at midnight that I am not proud of, asking if she was all right, and she replied the following morning, "I am more than all right. I am very clear. Please don't ask again." I have not asked again. I look at the date sometimes, the date she gave me that night, the specific event she described. I mark it on my calendar in a way I would not be able to explain to anyone who asked what the notation meant. I do not know if I believe her. I do not know if believing her would be better or worse than not believing her. I know that I sleep very lightly now, that I notice the threshold she described, the almost waking, the border, and that I do not stay there, that I come back quickly, deliberately, every time, that whatever is on the other side of that border has been patient with my sister for 4 years now. I am not sure it is equally patient with everyone, and I am not ready to find out. She called it the other sleep, and she said it the way you say the name of a place you have been to and miss, not with fear, not with dread, but with a specific quiet longing that was worse than either. My sister was 3 years younger than me. I want to use the past tense carefully here because she is not dead. I need you to know that before anything else, because the story has a shape that might make you assume otherwise. She is alive. She lives in a city I am not going to name, in an apartment I have not been to, and she has asked me not to contact her, and I am respecting that. And the grief of that is its own thing, separate from everything I am about to tell you, but not entirely separable either. We shared an apartment for 2 years. This was her idea. She had moved to the city for graduate school. I was already there. It made financial sense, and we had always been close in the way that sisters with a small age gap are close, which is to say, entirely with the specific intensity of people who have known each other longer than they have known themselves. The first time it happened, I was not there. She told me about it the following morning over coffee, the way you tell someone about a strange dream, with a kind of bemused detachment, as if the experience belonged to a slightly different version of yourself. She said she had woken in the night, or had almost woken, had arrived at the border of consciousness without crossing it, and had stayed there. Not paralyzed. She was clear about this distinction and returned to it every time she described the experience. She was not frozen. She was suspended. held at the threshold by something that felt, she said, deliberate. I said, "That's sleep paralysis. It's common, it's neurological, it passes." She nodded and drank her coffee and said, "Yes, probably." But she said it the way people say yes, probably, when they already know it isn't. The second time happened 3 weeks later. This time I was home. I heard nothing. She made no sound, did not call out, did not move in any way that carried through the wall between our rooms. In the morning she came to breakfast with the notebook she used for her research, and she read to me, without preamble, a detailed description of the building across the street from our apartment. 3rd floor, specific window, the way the light came through at a particular angle between 3 and 4 a.m. A plant on the windowsill she described as a large-leaf trailing variety in a terracotta pot that had been moved recently from one side of the sill to the other. I looked out our kitchen window at the building across the street. 3rd floor, specific window. A large-leaf trailing plant in a terracotta pot. She had not been at that window during the night. I would have heard her cross the apartment. She had been in her room, in the other sleep, seeing something she had no physical line of sight to. I need to stop here and tell you honestly that my first response was not fear. My first response was the particularly uncomfortable feeling of a person who has given a confident rational explanation and been quietly shown that the explanation was wrong. Sleep paralysis does not produce accurate external observations. Sleep paralysis is a perceptual event, internal, generated by a brain in a specific state. It does not show you the neighbor's plant from an angle you cannot physically access. Whatever was happening to my sister, I had named it incorrectly, and in doing so had made her feel, probably, slightly alone in it. I thought about that for a long time afterward. Over the following year it happened more often. Every 2 weeks, then weekly, then sometimes twice in a week. The experiences followed a consistent pattern. The threshold, the suspension, the observation, the return. She always came back with something specific and external, something she described with the flat accuracy of a person reporting measurements. Not visions, not imagery, not the symbolic language of dreams. Information. The neighbor's schedule, the water stain appearing on the building facade 3 days before it was visible from street level, the precise configuration of a room in an apartment she had no access to. Every item verifiable. Every item accurate. What changed, and this is the part one want to describe carefully because it is the part that shifted everything for me, was her relationship to the threshold itself. In the early months she returned from it the way you return from a place you went involuntarily, with a slight relief at being back, with the residue of something unfamiliar that needed a moment to settle. By the end of the first year she did not have that residue anymore. She came back the way you come back from somewhere you chose to go, settled, satisfied. Sometimes, when I watched her face in the morning after a night she'd been in the other sleep, there was an expression I had no word for. A quality of having been somewhere more real than here, a faint reluctance about the return that she never said out loud but that sat on her face clearly enough that I started watching for it the way you watch someone you love for the signs of something you cannot name. I asked her once, directly, whether she was afraid of it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "At first I was. But it never does anything harmful. It just shows me things." She paused and looked at her coffee cup and said, "I think it wants me to see clearly. I think it wants me to see clearly." I have turned that sentence over so many times. The grammar of it, the subject, the verb, the implication of intention on the part of something she was spending a significant portion of her nights inside. By the time she said it to me, she had been going into the other sleep for 14 months. She spoke about it the way someone speaks about a practice, a discipline, something she had gotten better at. The night that ended things between us, she came to my room at 2 a.m. and sat on the edge of my bed and woke me. I had not seen her do this since we were children. She looked entirely calm. She said she needed to tell me something she had seen. She said it was about me, about something coming for me, a specific event, a thing I needed to know before it arrived. She told me what she had seen. I am not going to put it in this video. I have thought about whether to share it and I have decided not to, and I want to explain why because I think the reason matters. What she described has not happened yet. It may not happen. It may be the product of whatever the other sleep is, something that shows real things accurately but not necessarily truthfully in the way that matters. I do not know. What I know is that she told me this thing at 2 a.m. with complete calm certainty, and then went back to her room, and I lay in the dark for the rest of the night, and something between us had changed in a way that neither of us knew how to change back. We managed another 3 months as roommates. We did not talk about what she had told me. We talked about everything else. Her research, my work, dinner, the news, all the normal surface of a shared life. But underneath it, the thing she had said was there every day, and I think she knew I was thinking about it, and I think she found my inability to simply accept it and move on, the way she had moved on, past fear into something else, frustrating in a way she couldn't fully articulate. She moved out in the spring. She said it was for practical reasons. We both understood it wasn't. She asked me not to contact her about the other sleep. I agreed. Then I broke the agreement once, 6 months later, in a message I sent at midnight that I am not proud of, asking if she was all right, and she replied the following morning. I am more than all right. I am very clear. Please don't ask again. I have not asked again. I look at the date sometimes, the date she gave me that night, the specific event she described. I mark it on my calendar in a way I would not be able to explain to anyone who asked what the notation meant. I do not know if I believe her. I do not know if believing her would be better or worse than not believing her. I know that I sleep very lightly now, that I notice the threshold she described, the almost waking, the border, and that I do not stay there, that I come back quickly, deliberately, every time, that whatever is on the other side of that border has been patient with my sister for 4 years now. I am not sure it is equally patient with everyone, and I am not ready to find out. He had been patient for a very long time. I understand that now. Whatever had arranged itself in that classroom register had not been in a hurry. It had put my name in a list in 1987, and it had waited 35 years for me to come back and find it. I want to be precise about the facts before I give you anything else, because precision is the only thing that keeps the story from sounding like the kind of thing a man invents after too many years in a quiet profession. I was a schoolteacher for 22 years. I taught in 3 schools, 2 in the city, 1 in the village where this happened. I retired at 52. I have no history of confusion about dates or places or my own biography. I know where I grew up. I know every address I have ever lived at. I know the names of the schools I attended and the teachers who taught me and the classmates who sat in my row. I was not in that village in 1987. I was 11 years old and I was 400 miles away, and I had never heard of the place. The school closure ceremony was the kind of occasion that generates a specific quality of sadness. Not sharp grief, but the slow ache of an institution ending, of a building that held decades of small lives being officially emptied of its purpose. Rural school, single intake per year. The village had been losing families for a generation, and the numbers had finally dropped below what the county would fund. 12 students in the final year. I had taught there for 4 years before I retired, and I was invited back for the closing. I arrived the morning of the ceremony and had several hours before the formal proceedings began. The headmistress, a woman I had worked alongside for those 4 years, suggested I might want to look through the archive room if I was interested in the history of the building. She knew I was the type. I spent my career collecting the residue of classrooms, old textbooks, class photographs, the particular archaeology of places where children spent their compulsory hours. She left me with a key and a cup of tea, and I spent the morning going through boxes. The archive was not organized in any formal sense. Decades of materials accumulated in the way school materials accumulate, without system, without curation, in the specific disorder of things kept because no one had made the decision to throw them away. Class photographs going back to the 1940s. Stacks of old workbooks. A box of broken chalk that someone had kept for reasons no longer recoverable. Exercise books with names on the covers in the careful handwriting of children learning to be careful. The class registers were in a cardboard box in the back corner. 1 per year, going back to 1961 when the school had been rebuilt after a fire. I am the kind of person who reads old registers the way some people read old graveyards, not morbidly, but with the specific interest of someone who finds the record of ordinary lives quietly moving. I went through them in order. Each one a list of names, an attendance record, a year. The handwriting of different teachers across different decades. The names cycling through the fashions of their eras, the Patricks and Marys of the 1960s giving way to the Aoifes and Sierras of the 1980s. I was enjoying it. That is something I want to be clear about. I was in a good mood, engaged, doing exactly the kind of archival browsing that gives me genuine pleasure. Nothing had prepared me for anything. I opened the 1987 register. The class that year had 23 students. Reasonable size for a rural school of that era. I read down the list the way I had read every list, with mild interest, with the distant recognition of names that belonged to a specific decade, without expectation of anything unusual. My name was at the bottom. Not a similar name. Not a name that shares a first name with mine or a surname with mine. My full name, first, middle, surname, the combination that is specific to me, that I have never seen on another person, that my parents constructed from a family name and a middle name that was a private reference to a place they had met before I was born. Age listed, 11. The same age I was in 1987. I sat with the register in my hands for a long time. I need to tell you what happened in my mind in those minutes because I think it is the most important part of the story and the easiest to gloss over. The first thing I felt was not fear. It was the specific vertigo of encountering something that should not be possible within the system of understanding you have used to navigate your entire life. Not a ghost, not a sound, not an experience that could be attributed to perception or stress or the particular vulnerability of a tired mind. A document, ink on paper, a name in a list with a year and an age attached to it, sitting in a cardboard box in a school archive for 35 years. I set it down. I picked it up again. I read it 4 more times. Then I did what I have always done when I encounter something I cannot immediately explain. I looked for the explanation. I went through every other register in the box, checked for my name in any other year. Perhaps someone had misfiled a page. Perhaps the name appeared elsewhere in a context that would make it comprehensible. It did not appear in any other register. Only 1987. Only at the bottom of the list, below the other 22 names, in handwriting slightly different from the rest of the entries. Slightly more deliberate, slightly more careful, as if it had been added with more attention than the others. I asked the headmistress, when the ceremony was over and we were having tea in the empty classroom, whether she knew anything about the 1987 class, whether any records had been transferred from other schools, whether there had ever been a student with my name in the village's history. She looked at me for a moment with an expression I could not read. Then she said, "I wouldn't know about before my time." And she changed the subject in the smooth, practiced way of a person who has had experience redirecting conversations they do not want to have. I took a photograph of the register page. I have looked at it regularly since. The name is clear in the photograph. My full name, my age in 1987. Enrolled in a school in a village I had never visited. In a year I was 11 years old and living 400 miles away. I have not found an explanation. I have looked in the way a former teacher looks, methodically, without drama, following the available threads. No other person with my full name appears in any record I can access. No clerical error I can construct accounts for the specificity of the age, which matches mine exactly. No theory I have managed to build stands up to more than a few minutes of examination. What I keep returning to is the patience of it. 35 years in a cardboard box, waiting for the archive room to be opened, for the right person to come back for a closing ceremony, for the morning hours to stretch long enough that a man with a habit of reading old registers would get to the bottom of a box and find his own name in a year he was not there. It did not need to frighten me. Whatever it was, it did not need to be dramatic about it. It had already written itself into the record. It had already claimed the space. It was simply waiting for me to arrive at the evidence that it had always been there. I closed the school that afternoon. I drove home. The photograph is on my phone. I look at it sometimes and I think about what it means that something knew my name in 1987. I think about what it was waiting for me to understand. I think I am still, at 52 years old, only partway through understanding it. I found it at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday and I didn't sleep again for 3 days, and by the time I came up for air I had filled 4 notebooks and I still don't know what it said. I do know what it did to me. That part one can describe with precision because I lived inside it and I watched it happen the way you watch a car going off a road when you are the one driving and also somehow standing on the verge watching. I am a sound engineer. Was, more accurately, though I still do the work, I do it differently now, with a specific caution I did not have before, a habit of stopping before I go too deep into a file. You develop a relationship with audio over years of working with it. You learn to hear things that untrained ears miss, the artifact beneath the clean surface, the ghost frequency underneath the recorded one, the thing that was present in the room when the microphone was running that the microphone was not pointed at. This skill is useful in the work. It is less useful when the thing you are hearing underneath is something you cannot stop hearing once you have started. The project was a documentary. Independent production, low budget, the kind of thing I took because I believed in the subject and the pay was thin but acceptable. A filmmaker documenting the history of a psychiatric facility that had been closed since the early 90s. The building still standing, the county unwilling to fund demolition. The filmmaker getting access through a historical society arrangement that gave her 3 days inside with a camera crew. I was not there for the shoot. I received the audio files remotely and began the cleanup work from my studio at home. Standard process: noise reduction, level balancing, removing the handling noise and electrical hum that accumulates in old buildings. Routine work. I had done it 100 times. The file was labeled simply: Interior Corridor, Building B, 1430 to 1510. 40 minutes of ambient recording, the kind of wide coverage sound teams capture to use under interview audio, to fill the acoustic space of a room. I had 20 files like it. I was processing them in order. At the 31-minute mark, I heard something that made me stop. It was not a voice. I want to be clear about that because the mind reaches for voices when it encounters the unexpected in audio, and what I heard was not a voice. It was a pattern, a rhythm buried beneath the ambient hiss of the corridor, below the frequency range of most listening, below the threshold of casual attention, but clearly present when you were working at the level of resolution I was working at. 43 seconds of it, beginning at the 31-minute mark, ending at the 31-minute 43-second mark. Then gone, the ambient hiss resuming as if nothing had interrupted it. I isolated the segment. I ran a spectral analysis. The pattern was there in the visual representation, a series of peaks and intervals that were too regular to be mechanical noise and too structured to be artifact. It had a rhythm. It had, when I stared at the spectral display long enough, what appeared to be a repeating unit, a bass phrase that cycled through the 43 seconds with minor variations the way a theme cycles through a musical composition. I told myself it was interference. A signal bleed from outside the building, a radio frequency or a nearby electrical source resonating through the structure, and being picked up by a sensitive microphone in a quiet room. This happens. It is not uncommon. The explanation was technically plausible, and I held it for approximately 4 hours before the problem with it became impossible to ignore. Interference bleeds do not have internal structure. They do not vary. A signal leaking into a microphone from an external source comes in at a consistent frequency and amplitude. It does not modulate, does not develop, does not contain what this contained, which was the 43 seconds of something that appeared to be going somewhere and not quite arriving. By the second morning, I had slowed the segment to 1/4 speed and was listening to it through studio headphones at high volume. I had filled the first notebook with spectral measurements and interval calculations and a rough transcription of the pattern using a notation system I invented because I did not have an existing vocabulary for what I was trying to describe. By the third morning, I had posted a thread on an audio engineering forum with a sanitized version of the spectrogram. The responses sorted quickly into 3 categories: interference artifact, pareidolia, and the smaller third category that I read the most carefully, from 3 people who clearly had technical backgrounds and who said, with varying degrees of willingness to commit to the statement, that the regularity of the intervals was unusual. One of them said, "If this is natural or mechanical in origin, it is the most structured natural signal I have seen in 20 years of acoustic analysis. What is the source location?" I told them. 2 of the 3 did not reply again. The third sent a private message. It said, "I worked in acoustic research for 8 years and I have one piece of advice. Don't try to decode it. Log the file, note the timestamp, submit it with the project materials, and move on. Some signals are not meant to resolve." I did not take the advice. Here is what the following 3 months looked like from the outside, as I understand it from the people who were watching. I canceled 3 projects. I stopped answering calls reliably. I lost 12 pounds without intending to. I slept 4 to 5 hours a night in broken intervals, always with the audio running, always monitoring the segment on loop at varying speeds and frequencies and processing configurations. My studio became a room I did not leave for increasingly long stretches. I ate at my desk. I covered the windows with printouts of spectrograms. Here is what it looked like from the inside. Like getting closer. Like being 2 steps behind something that was moving just fast enough to stay ahead, that was leaving enough regularity in its pattern to sustain the certainty that the next configuration, the next processing approach, the next reduction in speed or increase in resolution would be the one that resolved it. That feeling of proximity to an answer, of the gap between you and understanding closing in a way that requires only one more step, is the most dangerous feeling I have ever experienced. It is more consuming than grief. It is more total than falling in love. It takes everything you have and asks for more, and you give it because the alternative is stopping, and stopping feels like abandonment. I did not decode it. I am not sure anymore that it was meant to be decoded. I am not sure the thing I was chasing was an answer. I think, in the part of my mind that I have gradually cleaned out and returned to something like function, that what the signal was doing was not communicating. I think what it was doing was attracting. I think it was calibrated for exactly the kind of person who would find it, trained in audio, precise in analysis, constitutionally unable to leave a pattern unresolved, and that its purpose was not to be understood but to be followed, and following it was the point, and where following it led was the 3 months I lost, and the 12 pounds, and the covered windows, and the version of myself I have been slowly reconstructing since. I submitted the documentary audio without the segment. I told the filmmaker it was interference artifact and not usable. She accepted this. The original file is on a drive in my studio. I have not deleted it. I have not opened it in 14 months. I tell myself I have not deleted it because I may need it someday as evidence, as reference, for reasons I leave deliberately vague even to myself. The honest version is simpler. I haven't deleted it because some part of me is still listening. And that part does not want the signal to stop. That's where we leave you tonight, with locked doors that don't explain themselves, phones that should be silent, and floors that shouldn't exist. These are the stories that never make the news because no one knows how to file them. If something here kept you up, good. That means it worked. Subscribe to Unheard Fears, hit the bell so nothing slips past you, and drop your own 3 a.m. story in the comments. We read every one. Sleep well, or don't.